I have this enormous advantage of wandering as a writer into worlds that people know absolutely nothing about. It's as if in the days of African exploration, I mean, imagine how eagerly their work was devoured when it came out. And in a sense, I'm very lucky with this participatory journalism notion, because people are very curious about what goes on in these worlds. Hello, I'm George Plimpton, and this is Writer's Workshop. It's been said of today's guest that he will try almost anything, if only he can take notes and write about it afterwards. Well, I'm going to let you in on a secret. What this writer really enjoys is not writing, because that's too frustrating, and not professional football or hockey, because that can be pretty rough on an amateur. What this writer really enjoys is being an editor. In case you hadn't guessed, he is George Plimpton, jack of all trades and master of absolutely none, as you'll hear on Writer's Workshop. I keep wondering what I would have written. I very often criticized for spending too much time in this participatory journalism. Why doesn't he write about other things? Why doesn't he do this? Why doesn't he do that? And I've often wondered what would have happened to me as a writer if I had not thought of this. I mean, hasn't that really been... I mean, I'd like to think that I could have succeeded at doing entirely different types of writing, but I don't think they would have been the public interest. I don't think I could have ever sold 1 million copies of one book, writing about, let's say, politics. I have this enormous advantage of wandering as a writer into worlds that people know absolutely nothing about. It's as if in the days of African exploration, I mean, imagine how eagerly their work was devoured when it came out. And in a sense, I'm very lucky with this participatory journalism notion, because people are very curious about what goes on in these worlds.
Of all of the things you've done as a writer, the sports, the cultural activities, the performances of all kinds, which did you enjoy most and why?
Well, I'm not sure I enjoyed any of them, to tell you the truth. Certainly not the confrontations, because they're humiliating and unpleasant and rather staggering and not particularly good for the health. The great compensation were the personnel of these various organizations that I was able to become a part of and keep notes on, fill notebooks about. And that was the great pleasure. The sport itself was never really very enjoyable for me to play, because I, as an amateur, am so far below their pitch that it's a type of awkwardness that one goes through all the time. One is crippled, really. So the compensation with these great characters, one after the other, that you find in any profession, whether it's an athletic team or a symphony orchestra or dancers or opera folk, whatever, that's the compensation and the pleasure and the enjoyment.
Since you deal with high-intensity situations and that's what you enjoy writing about, I'm curious as to how much revision goes into your work, or how much time is the first impulse that you write down. Is that usually what you stick with, or do you rework it a lot, or how does that figure in?
Well, I used to carry a notebook around on these playing fields, and kept one in my helmet when I played football. And in hockey, I used to keep it in the goaltender's pads. And the notebook would serve two functions. It would make me continue to think that I was a reporter rather than a football player or a goaltender, because the temptation, of course, when you get into that moment of stress is to spend all your time concentrating on being able to do the best you can, and you sort of forget that you're a writer. But when you take your helmet off and a notepad falls out, then you sit down and you write a couple of things into it, usually conversation or usually things that flash into your mind as you're out there in this strange circumstance. I must say the athletes were always very puzzled by this notebook. In football, they used to think that I was a rookie with a poor memory, writing down the plays and so forth. But so you keep notes, and then what I used to do would be that night in a big ledger, and then expand on these thoughts that I'd had out there on the field, and particularly to get down the conversation or the noises, the sort of the background, and then finally when you start to do the book, you have to shift and rearrange these things so that somehow in each chapter has a sort of a beginning, those traditional things, the beginning and a middle and an end. And you use these little chips as if you were putting a puzzle together to fit into the mosaic of the whole. I'm doing a book on fireworks at the moment. It was a great hobby. And when I look at the book, it sits in these tiny little sections, and I hope one day they'll all fit. At the moment they don't. It's like some terrible, it's as if a shredder had gotten a hold of my notes. I sort of have to hope I can sort of squeeze them all together somehow. It's a terrible process. I hope none of you are going to try this.
Why did you not act in the movie, The Paper Line?
Well, yeah, that was rather dismaying. I wanted to, as a matter of fact. I thought I could probably play myself as well as anyone. But the role was written for Jack Lemmon. It was supposed to be a comic figure. And they felt that just a straight documentary on what I'd gone through as a football player wouldn't be enough for a film. So they had to, and the word for it was to Hollywoodize it. And they wanted Jack Lemmon to play the part. And the writers came in and they composed a movie script that was full of gags and full of scenes that required, they felt, a trained actor to do. And so Jack Lemmon turned it down, somewhat I might add to his regret. He always has said later he would like to, but he had another commitment. And so then they gave it to Alan Alda, which started him on his meteoric career. But that's the reason. They had to have a trained actor to do it.
I understand you were a stand-up comic at one time. Do you remember
I was a stand-up. I don't know how much of a comic I was.
Do you remember any of your original, your routine?
My routine? Well, the routine was written for me by some comedy writers, and it was full of sort of sharp Hollywood gags about Howard Hughes and John Wayne and so forth, and I had a very hard time with these things. And I remember going to these writers and saying, look here, I don't really think you've captured my style. And one of the writers said, Plimpton, if we could capture your style, we'd put it in a cage and club it to death. Oh, I had a wonderful set of tutors. I had Bob Hope and Jonathan Winters and Woody Allen and Steve Allen and a whole bunch of them, Phil Silvers, and they all tried to tell me what it was going to be like out there in front of a great audience at Caesar's Palace. An unknown comic from New Jersey just suddenly appearing. And almost all of them said that I wasn't going to really have a very good time out there. You see, I think the interesting thing about comedy is that everybody, I mean, we all laugh about 20 or 30 times a day, unless there's something truly wrong with us. So we all say funny things that make other people laugh. I mean, it's as common a commodity as cooking. Everybody can make somebody laugh. And yet, when you think of people who do it as a living, there are only, what, about 10 that I can think of. So it's quite odd. What is the difference between performing in public and performing in one's living room? Well, one of the answers to that is that a comic figure has established a type of persona over the years. I mean, Jack Benny could come out there and he could wring his hands in this rather curious way, and he could say, well, and people would roar with laughter, whereas we could go out there and wring our hands until they got raw and try different types, so nothing would ever happen. So part of being a great comedian is that you establish a sort of a personality, and then you go out there and one line, as in Roger Dangerfield's "I Ain't Got No Respect," brings down the house. But he's worked on establishing that line as his signature for years. So my great disadvantage was to walk out there with no persona whatsoever and deliver these lines. So I didn't have a very good time. The analogy I found for it was like deep sea fishing at night. Because when you look out there, it's black, and you can see these little candles glittering on the table. And it was like casting, and sometimes one of these lines that these two gag writers had written would catch. It was very heady. You'd hear the audience laughing out there. There'd be a weight on the line. And then the next gag you throw out there wouldn't be anything. And,
that silence must be awful.
It is, and you hurry on to the next gag. And,
hoping that things will get better.
And very often they don't.
Learn something about comedy from that experience that you could incorporate in your writing?
Well, I think there's a great difference between going out and trying to entertain people on a stage and writing comedy. I think writing is probably a little easier because you don't have to provide this persona, you don't have to be able to speak lines, you don't have to look funny, you don't have to do funny things with your hands. It's in your mind, and you're putting it down on a page, and you have a lot of time to fuss with it. And so I think that's probably easier. I think the great danger in writing comedy is that you should look at it maybe a week from when you write it down, and almost invariably it is not funny at that point, particularly if it's burlesque or broad humor of some sort. You have to look at it over and over again, and it shouldn't be topical either, because humor dies very quickly. But I don't think there's really a relationship between the two. I didn't learn anything about writing comedy or writing humor from this thing I did at Caesar's Palace. I just learned how difficult that particular profession was.
I think myself that there's a frightening similarity between what the comedian does and what the poet does. To get into my own field for a minute, someone like Jonathan Winters tells a joke. He builds up a situation, much as a person would do in a poem, and then this is what the poet tries for at the end, is to pay it off in some sort of unforgettable way. And to this end, I watch the comedians almost religiously.
Mr. Plimpton, you may not have developed a persona as a stand-up comic, but you've certainly developed a style. Would you tell us a little bit about how you got started?
You mean style as a writer?
Yes.
I don't truly know where that comes from, and I'm not sure that many writers do. Obviously, you learn, I think, from the books that you read. Was it Butler who said style is the man? I never can remember.
A lot of people have said that.
Yeah, I think so. I think it probably just emerges. And I remember Hemingway once saying, and he has probably the most distinctive style of all, that very often style was a mistake, that were mistakes, and that you never really cleared up quite or didn't know how to improve, and that it was not as carefully honed and prepared as, because if you start to do that, then you begin to get parody. You begin to slop over into that. So I certainly it isn't worked out. I think what happens when you write is that you sit down and you write as clearly as you can, because that's the important thing, isn't it? Try to get over what you've seen or what you want to say. And then you go over it and you pare it away until you have made that effect. I have a terrible time with my writing, because I don't really think I'm a very good writer. I think I'm probably a much better editor than a writer, and if you can be extremely disciplined and keep going over your stuff until you pare away the excess and pare away the things that you've tried that don't work, if you do that, then you probably come down to fairly simple, declarative prose, which is probably the best.
We're always told how different every writer is and how differently they start and how differently they work. But since you've done so many interviews with different writers and studying their styles, what are some common qualities that you can say of great or good writers?
Well, I think most of them pretend not to like it very much. That seems to be a common a common feeling about writing. And I think that is because it's so frustrating. I mean, you see the image in your mind, and the distance between getting that image onto a piece of paper is 80 miles long from here out the tip of the pen. And you never really can quite get it right. And that's frustrating. And it's quite unlike other professions. I mean, if you're a dentist and you're filling somebody's tooth, you fill it and it's done, and you take the bib off, and that person goes out into the world with a good tooth, or an operation, usually, one hopes. But with writing, most people abandon it, finally. That's the famous phrase, the art of work. The art is never finished, it's abandoned. And so there's something frustrating about that, I think. And I don't know many writers that can read over their own work with pleasure. They go over it gently. That's what E.M. Forster said. I look at it very gently whenever he did. So that seems to be a common, I don't know whether James would agree with this, but I think that that's a common constant, isn't it?
Yeah, I have, my own work is being reissued, early work, and I go back and I read it, and I'm very much against revising something that you did years and years ago, because you're really not the same person. I don't know really exactly why I had certain perceptions, say back 20 years ago, that I had, or why I chose to write in a certain way. That's lost to me now, and I don't really know why I did it that way. But I can read over my main feeling when I go back and read my own work, especially the work, say, that far back, is to think, well, now, Jesus, isn't that good? But there's something wrong with it. You know, it's a good idea. This is very good, but if I got this in class, I'd tell this guy to do something else right here, right there, with this phrase or this rhythm or this. That's not something that's not quite right about it. And the temptation is to revise it, but it wouldn't be any better. At least I don't. In my case, I don't think it would, and might be considerably worse. But I agree with George, and but I enjoy writing very much. In fact, when I get a choice of words, say I have an option of one word among 20 or 30 or 50 or 100, and I get one that seems clearly to me to be righter than the others, that fills me with a very deep sort of thrill that I couldn't get from anything else. I just say, yeah, good on you, buddy. That's right. That's just right. And if you get one, that's very rare too, but it does come. And you have the consolation of knowing that if you just sit there and wrestle with the problem, it will eventually come back again, that feeling. And once you've had it, the feeling of an absolute rightness that only you could achieve, because of your genes and your background and your particular personality and your orientation toward language. And so once you've had that, nothing in the world will substitute for it, because there's nothing in your experience that can be that good, that can give you the feeling of self-justification to the extent that can. You look at the history of writers, and anyone who's not a writer who hasn't had that feeling, it would be difficult for them to understand it. But you look at the history of writers and you see how many of them have gone down the drain on drink and have sold their mothers into slavery and betrayed the people that loved them and so on, all for the pursuit of this perhaps illusory satisfaction and so on. But once you've had it, you can see why they did it, and you're not sure that you're not going to do it yourself, you know.
And Faulkner said you should do it.
Yeah.
What about depression in writing? Do you get depressed a lot? I mean, it's just natural that a writer goes through these things, right?
Well, as I was saying before, I think it's an extremely difficult profession. It's wonderful to hear Jim say that he enjoys it. I think one does get terribly depressed. I mean, I'm depressed at this very moment because I know that I have 3 books that the publishers are angry about because they haven't got them on their desks. I would rather do almost anything. I mean, if someone calls up at 11 o'clock and the deadline is at noon and wants to play a set of tennis, I will play tennis. Because I know that if I look at the piece of paper, I will be thinking about what fun it would be at that very moment to be playing tennis. I think the disciplines that that people starting off have to learn have a great deal to do with that. Learning how to put everything else out of your mind and sitting down and writing 3 hours a day, 2 hours a day. But I remember Hart Crane, in writing his poetry, would sit and drink an enormous amount of booze, and he'd put on a phonograph record at absolutely full tilt to drive these words out of his head onto the page. And if you look at the pages, they're extraordinary. There's little tiny pieces of words here that have been squeezed out, like trying to get the very last bit of toothpaste out of a tube. Imagine what he would have been like as a house guest. This ranting man up there in his room trying to get these words out. And
listening to Ravel's Bolero turned up at the
absolute top
optimum.
volume.
Yeah.
And then he would take these little words, and then he would, and then cold sober, would then rearrange them into those remarkable poems of his. But no wonder the fellow leapt off the stern of that ship. I mean, depression, my Lord, just unable to get this stuff out. The depression should not come, and of course there is depression if you write it then can't get it published, I suppose that. But I think that at least the depression for me is in writing as a profession is in not being able to get the thing the way I want it, and somehow it's secondary whether or not it excites an editor or not. Usually, if it excites you, it's going to excite an editor.
Well then, would you give us some advice on how to get published or how to go about making the attempt?
Well, I think you have, this is, of course, everybody says this, but I just don't know any other answer to it. I think you have to write all the time. If I were going to start writing, as I said, I never thought I was going to be a writer. I thought I was going to be an editor, or I thought I was going to be a television executive or something to do with. But I never knew I was going to write, because I thought I had very little of this discipline. If I knew when I was 11 that I was going to be doing it, I would have kept a journal, written it every single day, tried to learn the disciplines that make you sit down and drive everything out of your mind and concentrate on the work. I would have become a stringer for the local newspaper, written for it. I think that an awful lot of people who want to become writers don't really write very much. They think a lot about writing, but they don't really sit down and practice the craft. I would read ferociously, because it's there almost through osmosis that you learn how other people have done it brilliantly, and study how they do it, too. And then I think you have to be a little bit lucky. The reason I became a writer was because I wrote some pieces for Sports Illustrated, which were published, and then we had this notion of participatory journalism. And the fact that I was able to be thrown into these rather remarkable situations and was able to do it a certain amount of justice in the books gave me a certain amount of confidence, and then made me very late on, really, try to develop my talents as a writer. Was that any help at all? The thing to do is just stick to it, and then, as I say, write journals and write for, I think, local magazines and papers, and then finally there'll be a chance where you'll either send a longer piece to a mass circulation magazine or to the Paris Review or whatever. It does require a little bit of luck. Someone's got to notice it.
Yes, Kurt Vonnegut and some of the other writers that have visited us have said that this particular time is a really hard time for young writers to get published. Do you believe that is so? Well,
I think in a way it's a very lucky, I'm not sure I wouldn't disagree, because there are very few people who've learned how to write these days. It's astonishing to me when you go to a writing class or when you see writers in other media such as television how poor they are. They just do not know how to write. They don't know how to put together a sentence. Nobody reads anymore. So that if you want to be a writer and you learn your craft and you learn grammar and you learn style and you learn all the basics, if you can do that, you have a terrific jump on most people, because they have not bothered to do that. And finally, when you learn to, I, in a way, think that someone who learns that craft is going to have a wonderful chance, because so few people know how to do it.
Do you think the difference between a writer with talent and a writer who kind of has made it but gets people to recognize that talent is good enough that people recognize it, how much of that has to do with personality, with pushing yourself in a way, or, you know, making yourself obvious, and as compared to the person that is good, that just kind of sits around and waits for someone to discover them, so to speak?
Well, that's, of course, a tormenting question. I think that it's very, in New York City, for an example, the writers collect in vast hordes in certain restaurants and in certain people's apartments, and you would think that a writer who was in that circle might have a better chance. He knows the publishers, he knows the editors, he can appear on radio, I suspect, but it's a very tough profession in the sense that what is valued, what is valuable is recognized, and what is not is discarded. So I don't think you can become a truly successful writer simply by force of personality. You have to have something that goes with it. On the other hand, you can't sit in Columbia, South Carolina, and write beautiful T.S. Eliot parodies, or better than Eliot, and not send them somewhere. I mean, people aren't going to come scratching at your door. So there has to be some system where you get your work into the mainstream where people can look at it. And there are all sorts of apparati to do this. There are agents and there are teachers. I've always thought that the best thing that an instructor or a teacher can do is, well, two things. One, to point out mistakes that students make. And if they're good, to try to show them where those roads are, either to send the work to an editor in New York with a letter saying, hey, I have a student here who's crackerjack. You really ought to take a look at this. And once you get into once you're lucky enough to get a good editor, that's a whole subject right there too, whether the editors in New York are changing. They are. Editors now spend a great deal of time sitting around deciding what sort of a book they would like to publish and who would be a good writer to get to write it. Whereas the editors of some 15, 20 years ago were editors that would take somebody very often of great raw talent and spend a great deal of time working with them. Maxwell Perkins, for example. There are not any of those editors around now at all. But still, the root is there. And I think a good instructor, a good teacher, a good friend, a good newspaper editor who recognizes this talent in, let's say, Columbia, can then set the work going to where a book is published, or a short story is published, or a poem is published. Yes, you do have to push a little bit. You just can't sit there. Don't get too good now, because we all hear these footsteps behind us. This is George Plimpton thanking you for participating in our Writers' Workshop. Please join us again next time.